Well, thank you all for coming and actually hanging out with us on Friday afternoon. Don't know if the weather is any good, but at least you're here. This has been a great conference on federalism, and really pleased to have some new research on this topic. In fact, we just released the survey this morning. Along with the conference, there are front page, I think, stories in the Globe and Mail and La Presse. They weren't necessarily the way we would have written them, so we'll give you our version versus their version. You know, I've done many surveys over decades on Canada and Canadians, and I think in some ways this is the most quintessential Canadian survey because it's about federalism and how this country is put together. And it's actually my first survey on this topic. So my good colleague Andrew Parkin and I will give you the highlights of the survey, and of course we'll have time for questions and discussion. And there is a full report on this research you can get at our website at environicsinstitute.org. So for this particular conference, I don't need to spend much time about the background of federation and federalism in this country. Obviously, we have a pretty distinct, if not unique, structure. Lots of ups and downs, turbulent times, calm times. And as I think last night, yesterday, the premiers were saying, it's been relatively calm over the past number of years, but obviously many issues have not been resolved, and some of these issues are bubbling up to the surface. Lots of discussion, including this conference, about some of the topics about where we've come and where we need to go. Think tanks, governments, universities, and so forth, there are things happening. But what about the rest of Canadians? What about the other 34 million or so who aren't at these conferences, who aren't part of this discussion? I think Christy Clark was right when she said that these are not top-of-mind issues on the minds of Canadians as they go about their daily lives. However, these are issues that people do care about at some level, whether they're conscious of it or whether they're thinking about it or whether they use the same language that we may use. So it is important, I think, to understand what all Canadians think about some of these issues. All Canadians may not be part of the specific decision-making process, but obviously their views are important, and as Danielle said, public opinion has come up at this conference in various ways. So it's important to do some research and not make assumptions about what Canadians think. And for instance, as somebody pointed out, all people in Quebec are the same, all people in Alberta are the same, and so forth. You need to do some research to test that out. So on this topic, actually Andrew and I have been talking about doing a survey like this for a number of years, and we finally figured out a way to do it. And then we invited some other leading organizations to join us on an equal basis. This includes the Canada West Foundation, CAPCF at UQAM, IRPP, and the new Brian Mulroney Center Institute on Government at St. FX University. And Doug Brown, if you're here, thank you for being part of it. And it's interesting because this is a bit of a federation project. There are regional partners across the country who have all collaborated on this project. So there's something very Canadian about it, but I'm happy to say we did not invite anybody from Ottawa to be part of it. So we didn't have to deal with that federal provincial level. What we're going to do is tell you a bit about it. These are the 6 partners. Our institute did the main work on the research, but all the partners were actively involved and supportive. This is this is actually a study in 3 parts. This was a fairly lengthy survey. We covered a lot of topics, but we're releasing it in 3 separate reports because there's too much to put into one report. So what we've released today is part 1. And the theme of part 1 is, are we pulling together or drifting apart? So there are themes about identity, respect and fairness, sovereignty and alienation. And those are the themes that we're focusing on and that we'll talk about today. And of course, we have 2 more to come down the line. It's not too far in the next couple months. In terms of the research, so this was a national public opinion survey, but not necessarily the ones you normally see. We had a very large sample of Canadians, over 5,700, age 18 and over. And one of the things we decided was very important for this survey is to be able to look meaningfully at every jurisdiction among the 13 so that we could speak meaningfully and report on all the provinces and all the territories. And in addition, we wanted to make sure that we had the Indigenous people's voice as well, so we went to extra lengths to make sure we have a large sample of Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And we feel that that's, for this particular topic, is extremely important to do. The survey was done both online and by telephone at the end of December and in January, so as Danielle said, fairly fresh. We don't think the opinions probably have changed too much since then. And another critical aspect of this research is to see how opinions and perspectives have changed over time. A bit like newspapers, surveys are snapshots, what's happening on a particular day. And that doesn't really give you the context of whether that's different or similar than before. So part of what we designed in the survey was to repeat questions that have been included on a number of other national surveys that have been done over time going back several decades, using the same questions in a way that we could compare the results and see have opinions changed or not over time. We think that's an important contribution in this research. So, what I'm going to do is start off and introduce, talk about some of the results on the theme of identity, and then I'll turn it over to Andrew, who will get into the media aspects of this particular research. Excuse me. I should warn you or advise you that the slides I'm going to show you are rather detailed and geeky, and you're probably not going to be able to read a lot of the detail. So a bit of an apology. However, I will tell you what's meaningful in these slides, and you could come closer if you're really keen to see the numbers and see if I got it right. So one of the questions that we asked was, to what extent do you identify personally as a Canadian or somebody who is a resident of your province? And here are some of those geeky results. So overall, I'll just tell you that about 40% of Canadians identify exclusively or primarily as a Canadian. About 22% say exclusively or primarily as somebody in their province, and about 30% who say equally both. So kind of an interesting mix. This slide shows the distribution across the provinces. We don't have territories on this one. And you can see that over on the left in Quebec and Newfoundland, the balance of opinion and identity is provincial. And over to the right, you have Ontario, where 55% or so identify primarily as Canadian, most of the rest somewhere in the middle. So, how has this changed? If we look at Canada excluding Quebec, over on the left side, we could see that there's been a bit of a shift, not a big shift, but a small shift from Canadian to provincial, but not dramatically, and I think this is a 16-year period, so really politically that's a long period of time. So there has been a bit of a shift, certainly in outside of Quebec, and also a shift in Quebec. If you look on the right side, this is Quebec Francophones, and you can see that particularly from 2017 to 2018, and there was a survey in between, there has been a bit of a shift, and as you would expect, most Quebecers identify much more as Quebecers than as Canadians, and there's no real surprise there. So in addition to asking about Canadian versus provincial, somebody from your province, what about other identities? Because those are not the only identities that people have. We asked about how important it is that your nation is part of your identity, your language, your region or province, your gender, your ethnic background or race, and your religion. And the results here for 2019 are sort of right across here. The dark red are people that say very important. You can see that significant proportions say very important. The pink is somewhat important. So you could see most Canadians place somewhat, if not strong importance on each one of these. And there's some differences. We can see that religion over on the far right, not as much importance on religion, and that's perhaps not too surprising. If we look at Indigenous identity, because we asked Indigenous participants a different question, it's the extent to which you consider yourself Canadian or Indigenous or part of your nation. We could see, it's interesting that overall, and this isn't on the slide, about a third of Indigenous peoples consider themselves primarily Canadian, and about a third consider themselves primarily Indigenous, and about a third in the middle. It's quite interesting. If you look at this by a particular group over to the right, actually that's on the next slide. What we can see on this slide is that the importance on Indigenous identity is related to age to some degree. It's actually older Indigenous people who are more likely to place strong importance on that identity than younger Indigenous people. And this actually, will come back to this at the end of my part of the presentation. This is the one I had in mind. So if we look at identity, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, we find that it's Inuit people who are most likely to say that identity is very important to them. In comparison to Métis, in comparative terms, it's not that they don't say it's important, but the strength of importance isn't quite the same. And finally, First Nations are somewhat between Métis and Inuit in importance. But if you look over to the right, those are First Nations on reserve. And what we found is that on reserve and off reserve really doesn't seem to make a difference with First Nations participants. Going back to identity in a broad sense, how have things changed from 2003 to 2019? Strength of importance of nation, broadly speaking, is important and has been very important. Most people consider it important, and that hasn't changed. But if you look at language, region, ethnicity, and gender, the extent to which people place importance on these identities have actually gone up a bit over the last 15 or 16 years. So it's kind of interesting to see that those identities are starting to strengthen, whereas religion is becoming less important. And that's part of the broad trend of secularization that's happening not only in Canada, but many other countries as well. I want to finish with a few slides about Quebec Francophones, which is an important group to look at, partly because most people outside of Quebec don't really understand Quebec Francophones very much. And this is showing the importance of these different identities by age group. And basically what this slide shows is that the importance of nation, language, region, province, ethnicity, the older you are, the more important those identities are to you. So those identities aren't quite as important to the younger generation today as they are with their parents and grandparents. And just to show you, I think it's the last slide, if you look to the left, this is the importance of region or province to your identity by age group. And what's interesting here is that you look at the blue line, Quebec Francophones, the older you are, the more important your region or province is to you and your identity. But if you look at the 18 to 24-year-old Francophones, they're in exactly the same spot as the youth in the rest of Canada. So they share region province in the same degree. The gap is at the older generation. And you see a similar pattern with language. Quebec Francophone youth and other Canadian youth are at the same spot. But as you get to older generations, there's quite a difference. All right. On that note, I'm going to end, and I'm going to pass the podium over to Andrew, who's going to take you through, I think, some even more interesting topics. Andrew.
Great, thanks, Keith. So as you know, I'm Andrew Parkin. I have way too many slides, and there's no one up here keeping time. So,
do it if you want.
If I were you, I'd be worried. If I was Alain, I'd be really worried. But how I'm going to do this, I'm actually going to try and go through things fairly quickly. It may be too quick. You know, we've got 13 jurisdictions, and I'm about to get into historical data, so lots of previous tracking points. I think it's better to give kind of a narrative. Happy to go over anything, and then, you know, as Keith mentioned, the full reports are available on the Environics Institute website, but also the detailed tables, data tables are there. So any number that, you know, you want to go back to, you can actually just obtain the full data. So I'm going to get into what, for me, are fairly classic questions in these types of surveys on federalism around how your province or territory is treated in terms of the respect it has, the weight it has in decision making, and its share of federal spending. So we'll start with the respect question, which has always been a favorite of mine. So is your province or territory treated with the respect it deserves in Canada or not? And I've just ranked them here from those who are most likely to say yes, which is Yukon and Ontario. And you can see, you go down and you get to Newfoundland, Northwest Territories and Alberta, where you're getting around 7 out of 10 people saying that their province or their territory is not treated with the respect it deserves. But it's the trends over time I want to spend a little bit more time with. And one of the things that I took away from the survey overall at this stage is that regions is, the concept of region is actually no longer that helpful. We've talked about regions and regionalism, but I think we've reached a point where we have 13 different provinces and territories and 13 different political cultures. So I'm going to try and illustrate that a little bit. So here's the trend over time for BC and Alberta on respect. So you can kind of see that they traditionally had stuck together with a sort of Western view on this question. And if anything, BC was a little more concerned. And then in the last period, then you just see that kind of becoming, in the report we basically say they're becoming uncoupled, right? And BC and Alberta are going in opposite directions in terms of the trend over time. Just throw in a little Quebec. I mean, my main point here is Quebec stability. So, you know, so much has changed over Quebec politically over this time, different parties in power, and then a third party in power and so on, and then some things never change. Ontario, we were doing well there for a while, and you know this is not good for me because this is basically my job performance measure, and it's going down, and I'm trying to pull it back up, but it's not getting there. So, and then I just throw a couple more pairs here again just to illustrate. So Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are converging. So we saw Alberta and BC sort of diverging, and you could sort of take from this, well, the province and a region are becoming more similar, but the point I'm trying to make is they're going in different directions, right? So the mood swing is different in what can often be superficially treated as similar in neighboring provinces. And for the territories, we don't have as much historical data for the territories. They're not generally included, but I just thought I'd point it out again, right? You've got neighboring territories that are, over this period of time anyway, on a completely different journey, right, in terms of whether they're feeling that Confederation is working better for them or working less well. So we go from respect to the question about your fair share of influence on important national decisions or the process of national decision making. And, so once again, we're getting close to 2/3, 7 out of 10 in a number of jurisdictions on the discontent side of this, right, saying they have less than their fair share of influence. There's a middle response here that I'm not showing. I'm not showing the more. There are a few people who think that they have more than their fair share. I'm leaving those out for. So you start Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Alberta, around 7 out of 10, and then you get all the way to poor old Ontario, that for some reason doesn't feel it has less than its fair share of influence at the moment. But again, the trends over time, so the panel on the left actually just repeats what I just showed you about that sort of opposing trends in Alberta and BC. I'm just trying to show that it's actually consistent across the number of questions, so it is a generalized pattern. So you can see again on that influence question, BC traditionally was more likely to say that it didn't have its fair share of influence on national decision making, and then the lines have crossed with Alberta in the last period. And then this is the trend just for Quebec, and I found this kind of interesting. So we saw the stability for the respect numbers for Quebec. I don't show it here, but on the fair share of federal spending, Quebec is actually more satisfied, so more likely to say it's getting its fair share of spending, but on its share of influence, Quebec is becoming less satisfied. So this is just one of the things that Quebec is just really annoying for researchers outside Quebec, because we've got 3 questions. You've got one that's stable, one that's going down, and one that's going up, and like, what is it with you guys? And how are we supposed to explain that, right? But I mean, I think that part of this is explainable in terms of who is setting the national agenda, right? And so as you come out of the post-referendum period into whatever period we're in now, then those numbers shift in Quebec a little bit. This is just a summary table, and if I didn't color your province or territory, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to leave anyone out, but if I colored them all, it actually wouldn't be that helpful anymore. So these are those 3 questions. Essentially, you get a group of provinces or territories that are always at the sort of most discontent side of this, and in this case, it's Alberta, Newfoundland, and Saskatchewan. So a fairly consistent pattern. And then you get a group that are always somewhere at the sort of least unhappy end of it. Ontario, PEI, Nunavut sometimes, and certainly Yukon right now, and that's a big change for Yukon. And then Quebec's all over the place. And then BC, I put BC there because if we had done this from the previous surveys, maybe 2003, BC would be right near the top as well. Right, so BC is really the one that has shifted its place in the way these questions play out. Okay, so we'll move to some questions that were not asked across the country. These were targeted to specific provinces, and we'll start with the questions from Quebec for Quebec. And there's 3 questions we had. The first is a sort of traditional question again, is the French language in Quebec threatened or not? So as you can see, either with the population or a whole or specific with Francophones, Quebec Francophones are actually slightly more likely today than they were previously to say that the French language is threatened. I don't think we can automatically, we put this in the context of a federalism survey because these answers correlate strongly with the answers to any other question about federalism or sovereignty and so on. But we're not trying to read into this some causal relation, right? This could be as much about Facebook and developments as that, as it could be about, you know, the politics of language in the Federation. But nonetheless, in terms of where Quebec is at the moment, it's important to bring into the conversation. This is a question that I like this question because I remember it was Maurice Pinard who wrote this question, and I remember, and I had the pleasure of working with him when we were writing this question, and we said, okay, well, we need something that's a little more nuanced than just, would you vote yes or no if a referendum was held tomorrow? So we had a kind of more identity question. Do you identify as a federalist or do you identify as a sovereigntist? And then we thought, naturally, we should have something in between for people who feel torn, right, between those 2 poles of the debate. And right before we went to the field, Maurice said, you know what, we should really have a neither, right? Because what if this is not the axis of identity that you live on? So I just remember that, and when we first asked it in 2002, even though it's only by a tiny little fraction, it was actually neither that there was the plurality response. But I think the story here, there's been a little bit of up and down. The story mainly, particularly for Quebec Francophones, it's not a huge difference. And you know, in the context where the PQ has finished with the 4th largest number of seats in the National Assembly, where the Bloc Québécois has more or less receded from the scene, not a big shifts in identity. So, you know, you can, this is a glass 3/4 full or 3/4 empty, right? You can say 3/4 of Quebecers do not identify as sovereigntist. 3/4 of Quebecers do not identify as mainly federalist, right? So make of that what you will, but it's more the stability, I think, that I'm taking from that. And then the third question in this series is, do you agree, disagree? Do you think that sovereignty is an idea whose time has passed? So yes, a slight majority of Quebecers say that sovereignty is an idea whose time has passed, but that's more or less the same that said that when Bernard Landry was premier. So again, a story of more continuity than change over time. Okay, so now we'll just move, if we move on to the West, this was a question of whether the West gets so few benefits from being part of Canada that they might as well go it on their own. Now this is the 4 prop, so you see, okay, there's a bump, right? And there's been ups and downs, but not only is there a dramatic increase, but it's the highest number that's recorded since this question was asked in the Focus. This is a Focus Canada question from Environics. Right, yeah, since 87. But keep in mind that this has all 4 provinces, including BC and Manitoba, who are not particularly as aggrieved as Alberta and Saskatchewan. So if you just take Alberta and Saskatchewan, which you see here, again, there's been ups and downs over time. There's been other peaks, but this is the peakiest peak that we've ever had. And since the last time this was asked in 2002, the number has effectively doubled in a fairly short period of time. And symbolically, it crosses 50%. Now, this is not a referendum question. This is not, you know, would you vote for independence tomorrow? This is more of a kind of, I would call it a gut reaction question, but that, I'm not trying to minimize its importance. I'm just trying to frame what it is. But that's a, you know, you do these questions, and at Focus Canada, these questions never time, and they've never seen a jump like that. It's the jumpiest jump and the peakiest peak. I'm making up language here. Okay. A few questions then, just about the nature of federalism again. The next 2 slides are, I'm going to take a little time. They could be just a little confusing exactly what we're showing here. So this is a question about whether you think the federal government favors one region over others. It's not saying which region. It's just asking you first in general, does the federal government play favorites? And so it's the number of Quebecers who say that the federal government favors some region, and the number of Albertans who also say the federal government favors some region. We'll get to which region in a second, right? So, I mean, this is just the Harper crossover here, right? So, it made a difference. It made a difference when he was there, and it makes a difference when he's not there. Okay, and then this is the question, for those who say yes, some region is favored, then this is the question of which region do you think is favored. So this is all Canadians, the red line is all Canadians who say either Quebec or Ontario or Central Canada taken as a whole are favored, and all Canadians saying that the West is favored. So traditionally, it's interesting to see that the line traditionally for the West was extremely low. And then it went up in the Harper period, and then it's coming down a little bit, but it's not disappearing. So the same pattern with the different question, and then just a little nuance here. So this is the proportion of Quebecers who mention a Western province as being the one that's favored, and the proportion of Albertans who mention Quebec, right? So, okay, I mean, you see naturally the period dominated by the referendum and the Constitution and so on. But yeah, I mean, a lot of these questions, it's hard to get lines to move this dramatically, right? So I think that this kind of really tells a story. And particularly, of course, in 2019, just, kind of different perceptions of what's going on in the country. And maybe the last, and this one I didn't see coming. Maybe I should have. But this is the question now of which region you think is favored. Looking at all Canadians outside Quebec, I did that because Quebecers are much less likely to think that Quebec is favored. But by age group. And I didn't see this coming, but essentially there is a generational hangover from those who lived through the mega constitutional or referendum period, right? So when we average everyone together, you say, well, certain number of Canadians think that the federal government favors Quebec, but that really depends on whether you lived through that time or not. And I was not aware of that. Shockingly, young people think that Ontario is favored, and I have no idea why.
Maybe it's true.
Yeah, maybe it's true. Have we talked about the labor market agreements recently? But and so this is the exact same thing. I just thought I'd show. It's fun to just show it. So this is all of Canada outside Quebec, Atlanta, Ontario. You can just see how steep those age lines are, and so I'm calling this kind of the referendum generational hangover. Alberta, BC, the same thing. So when you see that, people in Alberta think that Quebec is favored, it's people in Alberta sort of from the 40s on upwards. Okay, hopefully I'm still doing okay here a little bit. We're getting close. Last couple of questions on federalism. Has the federal government become irrelevant? So this is agree or disagree. The federal government has become virtually irrelevant to me. So a couple of observations here. First, I try and make sense of things as best I can. I cannot possibly explain what's going on in PEI, but Doug's here. Because the federal government's becoming less relevant. So I think the main story here, it's becoming less relevant, or this is a public opinion. People perceive it to be less relevant across. Always interesting to note that Quebec has never been the most pronounced on this question. But you can see again Saskatchewan and Alberta. I mean, essentially, it doesn't matter which question we asked about federalism in the survey, the pattern in Saskatchewan and Alberta is exactly the same, right? So again, it's kind of doubling of numbers. Interesting changes in the territories, which again, especially Northwest Territories and Nunavut, again, which I'm not overly qualified to comment on. How much of that is about a measure of discontent, and how much of it might have anything to do with devolution and so on, I'm not qualified to say.
I should point out that this question is not sponsored by premiers across the country.
Yeah. Although if they want to fund the next, no. Agree or disagree that Canadian federalism has more advantages than disadvantages for my province or my territory. Pattern's not as dramatic. Agreement is going down. Again, Quebec is not the most likely to disagree. I'm getting myself mixed up. Yeah, this is percentage agree. There we go. the numbers going down in Saskatchewan and Alberta again. Okay. That their advantages outweigh the disadvantages. So what Saskatchewan, Alberta, less likely to see more advantages than disadvantages. Okay, and then some final numbers, and then I'll sum the whole thing up. So we're actually not necessarily trying to say that this is all bad news. It's important to be aware of this, and I've always found the importance of this survey. When you say these surveys, everyone from their own province or region looks at their own numbers and said, I knew that, right? But of course, the point of these surveys is to show the Alberta numbers in Quebec and the Quebec numbers in Alberta, not to reflect back what people are probably already aware of just from living in a particular region or province. But not everything has a sharp difference. So do Canadians in all regions share the same values? Most Canadians would say yes. There is, you can see the number kind of dips a little bit and is split just a little under 50-50 in Alberta and Quebec. But overall, not a sharp disagreement on this as some of the other ones we've seen. Agree or disagree that a federal system of government is the best one for Canada because we are a country made up of many different peoples and nations. Okay, that tends to elicit fairly strong agreement and fairly consistent across the country. And a final one that we took, there's a great survey that was done right after the PQ was elected in 76, so the survey was done in 77. And it's hard to use all the exact questions because they were so peculiar to the times, but some of them we used. So we re-asked the question, do you have confidence in the capacity or the ability of Canadians to resolve their internal differences? So the good news is that 2/3 of Canadians say yes, they have some degree of confidence in our capacity to resolve our differences. If you want to go for the bad news, then it's much less than in 1977. And that's at this. I don't show the provinces and so on because there actually is not a lot of provincial variation on this. So just to recap, kind of where we've been through this journey. The Canadian identity remains strong, but we've seen the other identities are growing stronger over time. Most of us continue to have a mix of identities, so most of us do not exclusively go to one pole or the other in terms of identity. Much more pronounced generational changes in Quebec, so on identity questions, Quebec is much more of a society in evolution than the rest of Canada. And the Indigenous identity is, not surprisingly, very important for Indigenous peoples, though also Indigenous peoples, like other Canadians, have layered or mixed identities. In the West, the story is the dramatic negative shifts in views in Alberta, and the fact that for the first time, majorities in both Alberta and Saskatchewan now agree that they might as well go it on their own. By the way, I didn't show it in detail, but Saskatchewan's trend is actually down in terms of being less dissatisfied. It's just that they were previously so dissatisfied that even if it's actually gotten a little better, they're still one of the worst, if you're following with me on that. Opposite trends in BC and Alberta, so they have become sort of decoupled as provinces in the sort of Western alienation camp. We didn't spend a lot of time on it, but negative feelings about the Federation are not as pronounced in Manitoba, and they have not become more negative over time. In the Atlantic, Newfoundland stands alongside Alberta in terms of discontent, so there's nothing wrong with talking about Western alienation, obviously. It's just important to remember that there are other regions who have traditionally been just as dissatisfied. If that's a pillar of national unity that we can build, we might as well milk it for all we can. And Nova Scotia not that much further behind, a little bit of convergence between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And Atlantic Canada as a region just happens to combine one of the most dissatisfied provinces on a number of these questions, which is Newfoundland and Labrador, with one of the least dissatisfied with his PEI. Quebec, for me, the story is that despite all the headline political changes, more than headline, but you know what I mean, voting behavior, that on these questions there's much more continuity than change. Only a minority of Quebecers identify as sovereigntists, but the proportion of identifying as mainly Federalists is no higher and has not been increasing. So the lack of one thing does not mean the embracing of another. That's the story in Quebec. And the sense that the French language in Quebec is under threat is even stronger today than previously. Here's the story for Ontario. I figured if I put a meme in, I look 2 or 3 years younger than I actually am. But it's not, I mean, so Ontario is, just not overly likely to think it's not respected and doesn't have its influence and so on. It's just like an outlier on so many of these questions. I should say, like, Ontario's numbers have actually also gotten kind of quote-unquote worse over time, so Ontario is actually a little less satisfied than it used to be. And also, I don't want to imply from this that Ontario isn't concerned by the other numbers. Right? This doesn't, it just means that it doesn't quite get why everyone else is so dissatisfied, but it doesn't mean that it's dismissive of it. The North, which again we went through very quickly, but I take away from this that the 3 territories have very distinctive takes on their place in the Federation, and it's usually something we don't have the data to see that that's the case. But I think it's important to note that it's the case. Yukon and Nunavut are relatively satisfied. Northwest Territories, absolutely not right now. And those trends are going in different directions. Even though Northerners, if you ask less about how you're treated and more just about, are there advantages of living in the Federation, they're actually among the most likely to say that those advantages are there for them. And then the last one, and I'll end on this, and I hope that I left a couple minutes for questions, but there's still some sense of shared values in the country. There's agreement that the federal system serves us well given how diverse we are. We have some confidence in our ability to work through our differences. But at the same time, there's no way you can walk away from all this data and think that we're getting more unified necessarily. And the fact that those questions about how relevant is the federal government for you, do the advantages of federalism outweigh the disadvantages, it raises the question of of what the process is going to be to put all this back together, right? And who we're going to look to build the bridges. So I think, I'll just mention, so as Keith mentioned, this is a big survey and sample, big survey in question. So we have 2 more reports coming. My teaser is, yes, we have figures on support for equalization that I won't share. Report number 2. But I will share that my feeling from the second report, which is sort of questions about who should take leadership and how power should be shared. I've just started looking at that data. My sense already is that those answers to those questions are less polarized than the answers to the sort of feeling questions. So in terms of how we're going to get through this, it's not as clear as that people are sort of becoming completely provincialist and saying we're going to have to go it alone or solve our problems on our own, despite what we've just seen here. But we're at the very early stages of the analysis of that. And we have questions about relations with Indigenous peoples that were asked to all Canadians, and questions that were asked specifically to Indigenous peoples about their views on the country, and that will be the subject of the third report. So thank you. I hope, as I said, there's a little bit of time for questions and discussion. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. I just am thinking of our recent St. Patrick's festivities, and I'm wondering why our figures, when we talk about identity, don't cover our heritage, perhaps, or maybe dual nationalities and people who have immigrated to Canada or are second generation or third generation.
So well, maybe, yeah, we could both jump in. You go ahead.
Oh, well, we did ask about, I think the question was your ethnic or cultural background. And so that was, I mean, it's a bit of a catch-all, but that would capture people who came from other countries or have other heritages and so forth. So not maybe as precise as you might want, but still I think it was within the ballpark.
And we do also, the data in this survey allows us to look at the responses of those who are either first or second generation Canadian. We didn't show that here. Certainly on some of those identity questions, they would have come into play. And so two things. We didn't show it here because it wasn't part of this story about these types of questions and so on. But someone else could take the data and tell a very different story by looking at those variables, which is just another way to say that the data will become available and that we would be happy for anyone to take it and work with that. There's definitely the demographic questions that allow that to be worked on. But we did on those questions, like for instance, how important is language? It's important to Francophones, it's important to Anglophones, and it's important to those who have a non-official language as their first language. So we did kind of also look and yes.
Two quick questions. To what extent do you think the divergence between Alberta and BC reflects the diverging economic performance of the two provinces? And the second related question is, do you have any sense of how the feelings in Alberta compare to the feelings in the early 1980s over the NEP, CF18, that kind of culminated in Preston Manning and the West wants in and all those sorts of things?
Right. I think on the second one, I mean, we have data almost good enough to answer that question, but it tends to go back to the late to mid 80s, which captures CF18, but it doesn't capture NEP, and yet there's nothing that I've seen that indicates that some of these numbers would have been higher then. So we can't prove it, but I think we're safe to say that we've clicked over to something that we may not have seen before. On the economic one, I mean, I think like the answer is almost 100%. And again, I'm reading stuff into it. Mm-hmm. There's other people who could take the data and actually cross-tab stuff and so on. But I think it's those who are from the regions may be more qualified or are more qualified than me to say, but I'm curious to know the extent to which it reflects not only just their different economic conditions right now, but the divergence of the basis of their economies, right? And so the sort of the emergence of Vancouver as an an Asia Pacific gateway. Maybe it was always that, but you know what I mean in terms of finance and those types of things. And so I think there's partly a story there. It's not just who's boom and bust, but a sort of different drivers in the economy, which is part of the sort of thing that makes it less regional in that.
How do you read the question on identification with nation? If you had called Bernard Landry on this question, he would have said, oh yes, I identify with my nation, and he didn't mean Canada. And the National Assemblies in Quebec, I mean.
Do you want to?
Yes, it's a bad question. Alors, vous avez complètement raison.
It was your question.
Yeah. Whoever let that get by in 2003, it was probably me, but shouldn't have. But because we had it from 2003 or not, I think in that sense we wouldn't have emphasized that question too much for Quebec. It works outside, and the trend over time we notice applies to the other regions. For Quebec, we would emphasize more the question of do we identify as Canadian only, Canadian first, both, Quebec only, Quebec first, Quebec only. I think that's a more valid question for Quebec.
Yeah. Although the results and the change are consistent between the bad question and the good question.
Yeah.
So it may not be too bad.
Yeah. But it's something that trips us up from time to time.
Good point.
Thank you very much for sharing the results of this survey. I have two questions for you. I would like you to discuss a little bit more this generational gap that you identify in terms of identity in Quebec. I'm not totally convinced, just because your data show that the two youngest age group actually identify less to all of your questions. So maybe they just identify less the things in your survey. I don't really know how that can be, but they show lower support for all these identity. And I wonder if you aren't underplaying a little bit the very strong decrease in Canadian identity that we witnessed in Quebec with that survey. And also, I have data that using the same question in 1996, and Canadian identity was much higher in 1996 than in 2002 when you start the thing, and now it's very, very low. And also relating to identity in general in Canada, there is this argument, for example, that Professor Bélan made in some of his studies that there is a strong relationship between social policy and identity, and that the federal government and the Quebec government have been using social policy to try to shape people's identity. And what I see in this data, and I would like to be able to demonstrate this argument, but it's very difficult to do empirically. But what I see in this data is that, you know, the federal government's social policy doesn't spend much in social policy in comparison to provinces now. Whereas in the 70s or the 80s, the federal government had much more of a role and maybe could, try to shape Canadians' identity. They would identify with policies made at the federal level. But, I'm not convinced myself that this really matters in terms of people's identity. I would like to have your opinion on that issue.
Well, let me respond to the first question, and then we can go from there. I think that our data revealed a really striking pattern in terms of identity, different types of identity, and in generation. As you probably would appreciate, when you do research and you get data, an explanation or clarity doesn't necessarily emerge right away and tell us, well, this is what's happening, we know why. So I think the first thing it would suggest is there seems to be a pattern, and it's across a number of questions, so there seems to be something going on. What it is and why, I think, really merits more study. I think that more analysis of our data, other data. What we may be seeing is that younger generations may be actually be thinking about identity qualitatively differently. In other words, they may be thinking about and answering those questions with a different frame than older generations. We don't know that for sure, and I don't know that we would know what that frame is just from our survey. But it does suggest, because we're seeing it with different parts of the population on different questions, that identity may mean different things. And there may be categories of identity that were not on our survey, which are relevant to them in a way that perhaps in our next survey we should do. So I think it suggests some questions to better understand this. I think, as Andrew said, our tables are now posted, and we will, at some point not too far down the line, make our data files available. So we actually invite others to take our research and go further with it. So do you want to add to that? Or?
Yeah, well, I think that was helpful, but I'll add one thing to that and then try and answer the other one. The only thing I would add to that is just, you could be right? And maybe young people just identify with things differently. But the point we were trying to show is that's true in Quebec, and it seems not true outside Quebec. So there's still something to make sense of, right? So you didn't find the two color lines following the same path. That's what we were mostly trying to say. I think on the other one, so I was not trying to underplay the difference over time in Quebec. In fact, what we were somewhat trying to do, particularly more in the report, is sort of say that the rest of the country is catching up a little bit. In the sense, to get back to the question Alain asked about, is to say, if you just sort of forget about nation and Quebec for a second, outside Quebec, the identity with nation is not getting stronger, but the identity with province is. It's not getting weaker. It's the same. So to the extent there's movement in identity outside of Quebec, it's to make other Canadians look more like Quebecers, which is interesting. So that could confirm what you were saying about like how the connection between social policy and identity, if you're sort of saying, well, why is that happening? Well, we've had now more periods of the welfare state, provinces driving education, health, social services, and maybe that's helping form identity in the other provinces. The only thing I'm not sure is I'm not sure I would let go the idea that the provinces are that the federal government hasn't tried to shape identity through social policy. I'm not sure how quick I would be to let that go. And if you go to the Canada Child Benefit, I mean, I would even argue that for most, again, I'll speak for outside Quebec, healthcare, everyone in this room, right, knows who we talk about provinces deliver services. Provinces don't deliver healthcare. Hospitals and doctors deliver healthcare, right? That's you don't go to your province, and most Canadians think it's the Canada Health System, right? It's the Canada Health Act, right? It's a part of a Canadian identity. So to see that that's so present, and yet that's not where the movement identity is interesting. It just complexifies everything.
C'est ici, à mon tour. J'ai deux questions. La première, c'est évident que dans toutes les données, il y a plusieurs histoires qui peuvent être racontées. Il y en a une qui me frappe, que vous n'avez pas soulignée, c'est en fait le rapprochement de l'Alberta de la Saskatchewan. Dans la mesure où même à la fin des années 90, quand j'habitais en Alberta puis que je donnais des conférences en Saskatchewan, on ne m'identifiait pas comme venant de l'Alberta pour être certaine qu'il y ait des personnes de la Saskatchewan qui viennent à mes conférences, parce qu'il y avait tellement une différence idéologique importante entre les deux provinces. Et là, il me semble que l'histoire qui est en train de se passer, c'est justement l'Ouest qui se restructure de façon assez importante, entre autres à travers la Saskatchewan. Puis, je voudrais savoir, est-ce que c'est moi qui mets trop d'importance là-dessus ou est-ce que les données permettent de raconter cette histoire-là aussi? Le deuxième élément, la deuxième question que j'ai, c'est est-ce qu'on peut mesurer une culture du fédéralisme? Je sais qu'on est dans la perception. C'est quoi la perception qu'on a de chaque gouvernement? Mais est-ce qu'on peut arriver avec d'autres questions à détecter s'il y a un déclin de culture du fédéralisme? Si ça n'a jamais existé, si ça existe, comment est-ce qu'on peut les définir? Est-ce qu'on peut arriver à mesurer d'une façon ou d'une autre cet élément-là?
Je vais commencer avec la première question. Je pense que vous avez complètement raison. Anciennement, je veux dire au début des années 2000, quand on présentait des données, c'était à l'époque de Lucien Bouchard, Bernard Landry d'un côté et Preston Manning de l'autre côté. Et alors, tout le monde a pris pour acquis que le mécampement, le fédéralisme, c'est le Québec et l'Alberta. Et puis, on avait les données pour vous démontrer, non, c'est le Saskatchewan, la Terre-Neuve et Labrador, etc. Et ce qu'on disait à l'époque, c'est que pensez que vous n'avez pas le pouvoir que vous devrez avoir quand vous vous sentez fort, surtout économiquement, ça veut dire une chose, et quand vous vous sentez moins fort, moins nanti, ça veut dire une autre chose. Alors, à l'époque, Saskatchewan, Terre-Neuve avait pas de pouvoir, pas de pouvoir dans le contexte de la fédération, mais aussi manque de pouvoir économique. Mais c'est pourquoi Alberta et la Colombie-Britannique, je pense, étaient un peu ensemble, parce qu'il y avait quand même senti qu'ils sont eux-mêmes forts. Et le changement dans l'Alberta, on voit, ils vont de le côté de la Colombie-Britannique, et maintenant, comme vous avez constaté, ils ressemblent à Saskatchewan, et je pense que vraiment, c'est à cause de la crise économique. Ils se ressemblent, le Saskatchewan, beaucoup plus. I think that's the story. I think it's one thing to be annoyed and wealthy and feel wealthy, and it's another thing to be annoyed and feel your wealth slipping away, or being taken away, right, or being transferred away. The second one, excellente question à laquelle j'ai pas une très bonne réponse, peut-être parce qu'il faut attendre le deuxième rapport. The second question was about, can we get a sort of sense of the culture of federalism? I mean, I have to test this because I used to have a hypothesis that only Quebecers were really federalist, right? Because in the sense that Ontario wasn't, because it didn't understand there were two different governments, and the West and the Atlantic were because they thought that the job of the provincial government was to defend them against the federal government, which nothing wrong with that, but it's not really the model of federalism. It's not one against the other, right? And only Quebec sort of had this sense of, as Mr. Charest explained, right, two sovereign orders of government with different division of powers. And so I used to argue that only Quebec had a culture of federalism. I haven't had enough time to kind of test and pull it apart. So I think it's une excellente question qu'on devrait poursuivre.
Well, actually, to follow up on that question a little bit, to bring up this matter of maybe how people can have different understandings of federalism, I just want to ask you about your slide on the advantages and disadvantages of federalism. I didn't notice, it went by really quickly, but I didn't notice that many variations. The first question I wanted to ask is, are those variations statistically significant? And then the second question was, the question itself seemed a bit abstract, and I was wondering if that was the actual survey question. And if the fact that there didn't seem to be that many variations was maybe because of how it was worded and because people have different understandings of federalism.
Well, while he's getting the slide, it was not a specific question. We didn't describe advantages and disadvantages. It was a statement to capture people's sense that it was, well, there are pluses and minuses, but on balance. And that actual question, we didn't show it in the slide. We actually split the sample, and half said advantages outweigh disadvantages. The other half, it was reversed, disadvantages versus advantages, because we wanted to kind of test whether there'd be a bit of a difference, and I guess there was. On the question of statistical significance, we didn't really look at that, and I think the point I would make is that statistical significance tests are not necessarily all that useful when you're doing large-scale sample surveys, because when you have a sample of 5,700, a very small difference in percent might be statistically significant, and that doesn't necessarily tell you much if it's a 2 or 3 percentage point difference. I think we tend to focus more on conceptually, does it seem like there's a difference, 10, 20, 30 point difference, as opposed to whether there's a test that says 3 points is significant. So, Andrew, do you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, we're just having looked at the slide again, I think it is true that on this question, the differences in answers across the different provinces and territories are not as sharp. Mm-hmm. So I think what we're trying to say here is it's a downward trend in the sense that fewer are agreeing that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages fairly uniformly across the country. But that goes from you can see more data points in Quebec, a sort of gradual decline, and not that sharp, from 54 to 46, still hovering either side of 50%. And then again, you look at Saskatchewan, where it went from 60 to 30, right? From kind of halved. So, those two western provinces used to be more likely than Quebec to see the advantages, and now they're much, so, yeah.
It's not working.
That was the pattern, yeah.
I was very interested in your, Graham Fraser, I'm very interested in the slide that you had on the question, is the French language in Quebec threatened, which found a 10-point increase in 16 years. Mm-hmm. And that in the first two polls, not that long after the 95 referendum, 52%, which was not that much more than voted yes in the referendum, and then suddenly you've got this uptick. And I'm wondering, two questions. Is that I'm wondering if you made some reference of whether this was the arrival of the internet. I'm wondering whether the age break, whether I missed taking down an age breakdown. If you did find that younger people were more or less concerned than older people, or whether this was that as people aged, they were more worried about the inheritance that they would be leaving of the French language in Quebec, and more generally, what factors you think might have caused this 10% increase?
Yeah, I'll try. I know I know on my computer I have the slides with age. We didn't. From memory, I mean, there are differences, but it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't as dramatic as the identity ones, for sure. Otherwise, we would have kind of pulled it out. So I can check. But let me just say a couple of things. In my experience, a lot of those questions again about language are fairly cemented in, and I'm gonna. I hope I'm not name dropping too much, but I'm going to bring Maurice back into this because he had so many questions from so long ago, and this wasn't a new question we did this time, but he had a question from the late 60s that he had asked that was essentially about Anglophone and Francophone economic power. I can't remember the wording of the question, but it was more or less, do Francophones do French-speaking Quebecers have a fair chance economically in Quebec today? And he asked it in the late 60s, and we asked it again in the early 2000s, and the numbers were literally exactly the same. Right? And despite the quiet revolution, right? Despite the fact that economic power had, I think everyone would objectively say, had switched, evolved quite dramatically in the province. So a lot of those, I think, are deeply rooted. And there's a certain sense, if you could say, what incentive would a Francophone Quebecer have to say no? Why? And I don't mean this too instrumentally, but as a sort of, it's almost like I'm reading something, Keith was explaining much better the difference between, you know, what people answer on a question you give them and what they may actually be thinking underneath. I'm not articulating it as well as you did a little earlier. But they may be answering more on the sense of wanting ongoing protection, right, or something. I'm not.
It may be more of a political response than a personal worry about the language, if that's, I think, what you're getting at.
Yeah.
And just to go back to the slide, I think what we do know in Quebec among Francophones is that younger Quebec Francophones, language isn't as an important part of their identity as older ones. And now, we don't have trend data on that, but it would suggest that younger Quebec Francophones might be less worried about actual threats to the language if it's not as important to their identity. I mean, I think that's extrapolation, but I think that's a reasonable way to answer that question. Thank you.
One of the conclusions of your study was that a challenge the country is facing in the future is building bridges. What do you believe can or should be done to unite a country that seems to be drifting apart?
Well, that's a little outside our mandate, but I will suggest that one small thing that could be done is, actually, you know, one of the we're obviously invested in doing research, and we're going to be advocates. But I think there's some value and some power in this kind of research in different ways. And one way that this research can operate is to provide the opportunity for some empathy and to appreciate what it's like to be somebody who's unlike yourself. So it doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does. I think in some ways the extent to which people in a particular part of Canada may look at these results or a similar survey and appreciate what the perspectives are in other parts of Canada. So, for instance, Albertans recognizing that in Newfoundland there are similar feelings. You know, it's not a solution, but it's probably useful and constructive for Canadians to kind of get a sense of to what extent are their own personal views reflected in the broader views of Canadians. People may feel themselves kind of isolated and feel that they've got a particular view that's not shared by others. And then they might look at a survey or some other information and say, wow, you know, I didn't realize so many other people felt the same way. And that may actually potentially build some small bridges between different parts of the country. So that's a little advertisement for research. You want to?
No, that was good. The rest is up to Alain.
Yeah. Yeah, I think our next speaker will answer, right?
Yeah.
Perfect. All right.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting data. And of course, I'm interested also in the stuff you have on equalization, all the other things that are not there. So I will really go on your website and look at that. Regarding Alberta and the West, this idea that BC and Alberta are really taking, moving in two different directions. And Manitoba is already quite distinct in that regard if you compare to Alberta and Saskatchewan in many ways. How do we understand this idea of Western alienation? Because you say, yeah, because sometimes I live in Alberta and I live in Saskatchewan, and often when people talk about Western alienation, they talk about their own provincial alienation, but they generalize it or they extend it to the West. Mm-hmm. But what we see here is that they talk about Western alienation, but now today we talk basically two provinces, right? So, and you say yourself that now we have 13 entities, so we have 3 territories and 10 provinces. So how do you think we should use this concept of region in Canada? At least when we talk about public opinion, do we still have regions? Because you're saying basically, no, it's provinces and then the territories, 13 different entities. But in the political discourse, and even if you look at the article in the Global Main this morning, was about, there was discussion about Western alienation. But now you're telling us, in fact, the West, the 4 provinces, like you have the Canada West Foundation, when I spoke to them when I live in Calgary or in Saskatoon, they said it's Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC, but is it, right? It seems that your data contradicts the fact that there is something like, these 4 Western provinces, that they form a bloc in terms of public opinion at the very least, and in terms of identity even.
Well, I don't think it dismisses that. I think that maybe what our survey suggests is that let's not always assume that those provinces are a bloc, and that maybe used with caution, and in many cases it may apply, and it may be quite appropriate, but not to assume it is, and not to go to that so quickly, same in the north, same in Atlantic Canada, and to where there's an opportunity to collect enough information to be able to say, well, let's test that out and see if that's true or not. So let's look at the evidence. I think one of the challenges with survey research is that typically many surveys don't have large enough samples to look at those different provinces and territories, and that may be because whoever's sponsoring or whatever, it's not a priority. So perhaps this might suggest that there's more of a priority to look at that, and I'm sure some of the smaller provinces would probably get behind that very quickly.
I think what I would add is, I think it's prompting us to question when these categories are helpful and when they're not. So I used to live for a while in Yorkshire in England, and I remember the first time I used to take the train, but there was one time I drove, and I hadn't seen this before, and you get like half an hour out of London, and there's a sign on the M1, and it just says, the North. Right? and it's a sign that's put there so everyone in London turns back, right? Because they don't want to go. But the point is, it's like conveying this sense like there's London, and then there's the stuff that doesn't matter. So the reason I'm questioning it now is there's a danger that we sort of say, oh, Western alienation. I've heard this before. We've had this before. West wants in again, and nothing is new here. And I think what this survey shows is there's a lot that's really new and really specific. So I'm not the regional spokesperson who can say this is not the right label necessarily. I think that should come from our partners at Canada West, perhaps, and so on. But to a certain extent, that there's possibility that these things can become less helpful in understanding what's going on. And I would apply that to the territories too, where we call them the territories, right? Because we don't know enough here to talk about Yukon as a distinct kind of entity, and this, so I think we're just kind of poking us to do more research to get better data.
Well, just for others who are looking at this, to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Back.
Guy Lechapelle, Université Concordia. J'aimerais savoir, à partir de vos données, who are the true Canadian? Who are the true Canadian? Who are those who really believe on a kind of belief system on federalism or whatever? And how many people have read the proposal of Mr. Fournier to the rest of Canada, where these proposals of reconciliations or whatever, where they are now? And did you ask questions on that on your survey?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we should have asked on the survey, avez-vous lu le Québec, notre façon d'être canadien? Et avez-vous aimé le document, comme deuxième question? Everyone is a true Canadian, but I think there are those questions of values. There's one we didn't show where we said, we asked, do you feel you have more in common with people in the U.S. who live next to your province than you do with other Canadians? No, more in common with other Canadians. This is what it means to be Canadian. So yeah, it's whenever, that question, again, I don't want to dismiss it, but that question for the 4 Western provinces about whether you get so little out of Canada that you might as well go it alone. The reason I said, I'm not reading that as an independence question is because, and I'm reading into this, and I may just read in what I want to see, which is not good research, but I don't think the message is we don't want to be Canadian anymore. I think the message is we would prefer if Canada worked a little better for us. So I think, bref, everyone's a real true Canadian, and whenever you get to push those things that you really get to the value of being Canadian, that's when suddenly everything is above 50%.
Yeah, and other research, some of the surveys we ask from time to time is asking people the extent to which they're proud to be Canadian. And those numbers are pretty high and they're fairly stable. So despite all of this, it really doesn't mean that people are getting tired of feeling Canadian or being Canadian. I guess maybe we'll put that in our next deck.
Yeah.
Jean-Marc Fournier, jusqu'où vous les... Parce que ça passe vite, on n'a pas le temps de se faire une idée. Jusqu'où vous pensez que les réponses supportent la thèse du post-nationalisme de M. Trudeau? Ou si, à contrario, on pourrait parler de pluriprovincialisme plutôt que plurirégionalisme dans le Canada actuel?
La question est, est-ce qu'on devrait parler de...
Est-ce que ça supporte la thèse de
post-nationalisme? Ça fait longtemps depuis que j'ai réfléchi aux thèses de la post-nationalisme. Je pense que ça soutient une thèse de complexité uniforme. Et ça, dans une façon assez ironique, je pense que ça pourrait être, et je suis sérieuse, aussi une base pour une unité, parce que c'était toujours difficile ou c'était toujours problématique pour les pays si on pense que, bon, nous sommes tous Canadiens, ça marche, c'est facile, sauf les Québécois, qui ont des identités qu'on ne comprenne pas. Maintenant, on constate qu'il y a presque dans toutes les régions, il y a des identités multiples, incluant les identités qui n'ont rien à faire avec la géographie, que tout le monde est en train de naviguer et exprimer tout ça. Ça pourrait nous offrir une base pour un dialogue qui est... je ne sais pas si c'est une bonne réponse à votre question.
I think we'll make that the last question, the last word. Thank you all very much for coming to our presentation.
And just as Daniel is getting up, all the material again is on environixinstitute.org. I do have about 20 copies of the bilingual summary. Many of you are working electronically and don't want to carry paper around, so we didn't overprint. But if anyone wants the printed summary in English or French, I've got some copies right here.